Ayaan Hirsi Ali was born into a Muslim family in Somalia. She would become a member of the Dutch parliament and an outspoken critic of the treatment of women in Islamic societies. Next on Book TV, she discusses her new autobiography, Infidel, and her collaboration with murdered Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh. This is About an Hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back to a moment in October of 2002. I attended one of the first debates in Amsterdam on the 11th of September 2001 attacks in New York and Washington. The debate was organized by the publishing house Van Gennep together with a daily newspaper called Trouw. The title of the evening was Islam and the West, Who Needs a Voltaire? Between 8 and 10 p.m., I listened to 5 of the 6 speakers propose a Voltaire for the West. The West was arrogant, imperialist, and cruel, and took without giving. America was most evil of all, and Americans under the control of the Jews were responsible for all the conflicts in the world today. It was too bad that innocent people were killed in airplanes and buildings, but if Americans did not want to be attacked again at home and abroad, they had to change their foreign policy. Islam was a great civilization and only a source of peace. No Voltaire was required there. Only one speaker refuted these claims. Afshin Ayaan, an Iranian professor of law, then in the University of Amsterdam, pleaded for a reformation of Islam and urged that Muslims embark on a process of enlightenment. I was frustrated, listening to the other 5 speakers talk of Muslims only as victims. I agreed with Mr. Ayaan, and as he was outrageously outnumbered, I joined in when the audience was allowed to and supported him. I ended my plea with, "The West has countless Voltaires. Allow us just one, please." Then it was time for the break. The organizers of the event and various other intellectuals and journalists circled around me and started to question me eagerly. "Who are you?" "I'm Ayaan." "Ayaan who?" "Just Ayaan. The rest of my names are difficult." It didn't seem appropriate to take them through my bloodline at that time. "Where do you come from?" "Somalia." "Are you still a Muslim?" Of course," I stammered. Dressed in trousers, head uncovered, holding a glass of wine in my hands. I was not a very convincing picture of a young Muslim woman. "Well, a liberal Muslim," I shrugged. At the time, I was not aware of the logical inconsistency in the compound word Muslim liberal. "Where did you learn to speak Dutch so fluently?" "I live in Holland for almost 10 years," I said. "There aren't many places in the world where Dutch is spoken," I always thought when people asked me that question. "Will you write for my paper in which you expand on your intervention tonight about allowing you Muslims a Voltaire?" "All right," I said. "I will show the article to my boss first at the Labour Party think tank." The strangers around, almost all of them prominent thinkers in the Amsterdam scene, continued to question me, interview me, publish my articles, and so on. Weeks later, the guy who first asked me to write an article introduced me to a publisher. In early 2002, I think in March, she and I had a conversation that's not in the book. She asked me what I thought of the debate on the relationship between Islam and the West. I said, "Well, you guys, Westerners, have developed from stages of superstition, ignorance, cruelty, to societies that put an emphasis on reason, knowledge, and humanity. You have created man-made institutions, and you repair them as time goes by. We Muslims haven't done that. We live in tribes, we long for a utopia. Our dream is to build a social order based on the Quran, follow the edicts of Allah, and look up to the Prophet Muhammad for moral guidance and achieve peace, harmony, and happiness by abiding to the laws of Allah. Clearly, we have failed. That's why we come here in large numbers. It's quite a journey, I told her, to let go of the dream of a society designed by Allah. You won't understand, I said. You have to know it. You have to live it. Tell me how you did it, she said. So I told her where I was born, my family, how we lived, and why I came to Holland. That is the book you're going to write, she said. Tell us about your own journey from being a member of a clan to how you have adapted to our society. Tell us what it is that you still value in the moral framework you got from your parents. What you don't like about your old way of life. Tell us what you don't like in Holland and what you appreciate here and why. You overestimate the average Dutch person, she told me. No one has the time to read research papers on conflicting values. You will frighten your audience with terms such as empirical, data, consistency, and conclusion. But your story will help give us an insight into a world that's closed for us. Ayaan, my publisher, continued, do you think we know what goes on behind those closed curtains in Amsterdam West? We don't. Those curtains will open if the girls who live behind them tell us their stories. That is how we Westerners changed. We told each other our intimate stories, our experiences of injustice or of brutality, and we shared our methods of survival. She stood up and gave me books written by feminists in the early 20th century, books written by men who wrote in detail of how it meant to live in oppression, mental oppression inflicted on them by the father at home, the priest in the church, and the policeman on the streets. This was all well and good. I thought my publisher was a persuasive woman who cared about the world. But I didn't want to write a self-help book based on my life. I thought that was pathetic. I wanted to establish myself as an academic, as a researcher, propose a theory, set about data gathering, make a case on consistent argument, draw conclusions, and move on to the next assignment. I felt lucky that the Vieri Beckman Stichting asked me to look into the question, why did the integration of large numbers of non-Western immigrants fail? I gathered whatever was written on the subject since 1979. I concluded that most researchers overlooked cultural and religious variables. I looked for and found theorists who took these variables seriously. I concluded that for the integration of non-Western immigrants to be a success, one, a shift in mentality must occur from being a member of a tribe to becoming a citizen. Education directed at this shift of mentality must be put in place, that the best place to start is by the emancipation of women, and for all the above to be achieved, the approach of multiculturalism must be dropped. Cultures are not equal, but human beings are. For non-Western immigrants to live by the values in the Dutch constitution, they had to discard those tribal and Islamic values that were in conflict with the rule of law. These were the acceptance of man-made laws as opposed to divine dogma when the two clash, respect for the liberty of the individual, his life, property and choice of life, equality before the law, and equal opportunity between men and women, gays and heterosexuals. There was nothing original in my articles. Everything had been said and written before. But all the same, I generated great interest with my redundant articles and interviews. When I wondered why the work of great thinkers who are consistent, precise, and eloquent were not as much in demand, the answer seemed always to be, but they are men. And worse still, they are middle-aged. And worst of all, they are white. If I still looked puzzled after such remarks, then the female or young male with unwashed hair who asked for the interview would be kind enough to elaborate and say, you know, they tend to be racist. Be careful they don't use you as a ventriloquist for their abhorrent ideas. Besides, my publisher were my ever-decreasing Muslim friends and family, decreasing in number. You're selling out. Don't hang the dirty laundry outside. You're a bounty, white from the inside and with a disgusting black surface. Defend the rights of women, but never bring it in connection with Islam. You only want to be liked by the white people. The confusion of race and religion went unnoticed. When I pointed it out, I was accused of imitating, again, the white, middle-aged male. He, this particular species, just was deeply racist and was thankful to attack Islam as an outlet for his frustrated feelings. I left Holland and Europe with the impression that in the 21st century, no misfortune is greater than being male, middle-aged, and white. Very soon, you might start a charity here in the US to rescue them. This is the background to the writing, or rather the telling, of Infidel. Nowhere in Europe can an immigrant on the left side of matters, for that's where I am, join in a debate on the most pressing issues of our time without having to either join in the chorus of victimhood. We, the immigrants, and especially those of us who are Muslims, are victims of racism, Islamophobia, imperialism, and most recently, colonial feminism. That's new, Christina. Pity us, and let us bring in our most backward beliefs and practices under the banner of multiculturalism, or pay and perish, because your forefathers were slave traders, colonizers, and racist. Or make public every detail of your life that might convince your peers. Talk about your journey to the West. Try and recall your childhood. Tell it so that we can understand it. Put a face to the statistic. 140 million women who have undergone genital mutilation is too much to stomach. One woman among us we see, relate to, who is one of us having undergone that terrible experience will move us into legislation, perhaps. But then I ask, what about the United Nations reports, the immigration numbers, the excellent scholarly works of people like Bernard Lewis, the numerous NGOs, all there in the Muslim lands trying to help? What about the endless peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Kosovo, Bosnia, victims here in Holland, France, the UK, Germany, of honor killings, violence against women in the name of Allah? What would one more story add to the numerous ones? My friends on the left convinced me that it would be a story with a face, the story of someone we know, someone who made the journey and succeeded in becoming one of us with no mental or social despair. And thus I was elevated by my newfound friends on the left, catapulted from a recent graduate to an icon. An icon of what? In debating Islam and the treatment of women within Islamic nations, my friend on the left need a Muslim, preferably a woman, to agree or disagree with. The current debate on Islam and the West is not about the left and the right. It's not about the conservatives and the progressives or liberals. It's a debate within those on the left. In Europe, at least, I serve the purpose of an icon, or perhaps a measure of some sort. On which side of me do you find? If you radically agree with Hirsi Ali, you're an extremist. If you radically disagree with Hirsi Ali, you're an extremist too. If you agree or disagree, depending on what she's advocating at the moment, you're a moderate. Interestingly enough, this position is most common among my conservative friends. I often recall the evening on Islam and the West and who needs a Voltaire. What if I hadn't opened my mouth? What if I just defended the good things about Islam? In Infidel, you will read about my journey from a tribal Islamic life to my 14 years in Holland as a resident and a citizen. My journey of emancipation from the notion of hell, from the stifling social control of the family and the clan. My journey towards becoming an individual, and perhaps most interesting of all, my sexual self-emancipation. It's one story, and as life stories go, very subjective. It's not about empirical data, but about likes and dislikes, about prejudice and learning to discard them, about the frightening adventure of putting aside the moral framework that my parents gave me and adopting those of the great Satan, summarized in the motto, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am a happy individual now. I am happy that I can share in all this wealth of knowledge and progress. I'm happy here at the AEI. Chris Demuth doesn't ask to see my articles fast before they are published. But then that's probably because he's a conservative. I'm here for 6 months, and Americans don't ask me, where did you learn to speak English so fluently? But then perhaps that's because English is spoken in so many places. But I'm also sad. Sad that those humans who have inherited this social order, this civilization called the West, with its values of human rights, curiosity, rationality, trust, and integrity, might stand by and watch its decline. To go back to the conversation with my publisher, she had a point. The infidel seems to convince more than all the scholarly sweat of my mentors. It's a disturbing reality that citizens of liberal democracies will be skeptical of research results and allow themselves to be moved into a point of view. Westerners are good at self-reflection. If you ask me what you must wonder about the most, I will say, what happened to the temple of science and merit? Perhaps middle-aged white men, dead or alive, might have a point. Thank you. I'll take questions. And I think someone must come and point out who.
A microphone will be moving around the room.
Yes.
So, be nice if you introduce yourself.
Peter Range, editor of Blueprint Magazine at the Democratic Leadership Council. I heard the radio interview yesterday, or whenever it was, where this thing, colonial feminism or feminist colonialism came
Yes,
up, and
it's very interesting.
You touched on. And would you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you understand under that?
I didn't understand it. I understood feminism to be, at least in academic terms, I understood it to be for any individual, male or female, who aspires for equal opportunity before the law and equal legal rights between men and women. I don't understand what colonial feminism could possibly be. Maybe Christina Hobson will one day write on it. She's a great feminist here. Yeah. To be honest, I don't understand it. I just see it as another inaccessible, obscure word, compound word, to have us all move from what is wrong with discussing Islam and Islam as a body of ideas, as a philosophy. How does that relate to the teachings of the Enlightenment and to liberalism? And instead of talking about that, my position as a woman is much better here in the United States. I see it, I experience it, I live it every day, and there's enough empirical data. Instead of discussing that compared to living in a Muslim country, then people who have an interest in the status quo, I must say, would take us to such caravans as colonial feminism. I mean, you can put together every word you like. Just take the dictionary and put them together and you'll see what comes.
Well, I have a follow-up. As an editor, I'm very curious to know, did you write the book in Dutch, and did you have a collaborator, or did you write it in English?
I did not write the book. I told the book. No, in English. I sat down with a young woman, and she gave me cassette records because I couldn't write the book. I did not want to write about myself. But still, there was a growing demand on, you have to tell us how you made that journey. And so at first, in 2003, I had written the first chapter all on my own, which she edited, on my life between, my grandparents, my parents, and my life in Somalia. And that's all I had. And then she continued from that. She doesn't want her name to be told because of security reasons. She said she has 4 children and she doesn't want to be involved in this. And then she would record and she would prompt me and she would say, we will not understand that. You have to elaborate on that and get me disciplined and get me telling. And then she transcribed all that. And then I would look at the transcription and then we would just cancel out and say, this is important, this is instrumental to the story. This is a fine anecdote. It may make people laugh, but it's not necessary for the story. And so this is, in the end, what came out of it.
Ayaan, you say you are a rationalist. You believe in the power of reason, and yet you observe that your book has moved people, to some extent persuaded people, not by giving them reams of data and statistics, but by telling stories. Isn't that itself important data? Doesn't that tell you something about human nature? That people can be moved, as you say, that people can come to an understanding of something through stories. In other words, people can learn inductively from experience rather than deductively from raw statistics. And isn't that something that the rationalist has to take into account? I mean, after all, we are living in a world where human nature is pretty important for your project.
Yes, I understand that emotions and being moved into a different set of thought, to change your mind, to sway that's very important. But what I'm objecting to is the confusion of different realms. In the realm of literature and poetry, in the realm of storytelling, novels, biographies and autobiographies, that's exactly what should happen. And the more moving it is, the more convincing it is. And that is something we should celebrate. I'm not for the cancellation or the abolition or the suppression of emotions. But in the realm of science, I wanted to become an academic at the time. I was a researcher working for a think tank. I'm again a researcher working for a think. When I was a politician, what I despised was again and again and again being appealed to by people who would say, you know, your policy proposals, that's a matter of, the Labour Party is doing it, the Socialists are doing it, the Liberals, it's not interesting. We're interested in how we're interested in your story. It's like, move us into policy, move us into legislation. And that I thought was very dangerous, because they would point out to my opponents who would do exactly the same, who would move people into policy by saying, we are victims of imperialism. We need to stick to our culture and to our habits and to our beliefs, and you need to subsidize it as politicians and as lawmakers because your fathers and your grandfathers and so on did this and that. And then it was like you're confusing the two realms. And just like you should separate religion and the religious affairs and political affairs, I think you should also separate the emotional affairs and political affairs. And I would rather have a rational politician and a rational scientist than people who would move me and manipulate me into changing my mind.
Is this on? Where did you learn to speak English so well? No, just kidding.
Cheers.
More seriously, the left in the West, in America, specifically, organized very aggressively against apartheid in South Africa. And it was powerful, it was sustained on almost every campus. It was the focus of activism. We haven't seen anything like that around gender apartheid that exists in very virulent form in Iran and parts of Pakistan and so forth. There was some, early on there was some busy activism, to their credit, groups like the Fund for the Feminist Majority against the Taliban. But other than that, we really haven't seen an organized movement against this injustice. Why do you think that is?
I think that it really has to do with the confusion of race and ideas, philosophy. If in South Africa, the ruling regime had a philosophy that said blacks and whites need to be separated and they each need to walk different roads and blacks had to be suppressed, it just could not it didn't seem to be a convincing idea. It was an outrage against liberalism. It was also an outrage, by the way, against social democracy. But if Islam, as it is portrayed today, as the religion of the weak, the victims of colonialism, the victims of imperialism, and so on, and they have only one thing going for them, and it's their religion, and it's in their religion that they seek comfort. Who are you, white, middle-aged man, left or right, it doesn't matter, to come around and take that last little place where people can draw themselves into? Who are you to take that away from them? And so that's why I say the debates going on, I mean, the rights, the conservatives and so on have always been seen as insular. They only care about themselves. They don't care about the rest of the world. It's the left who always cared about the other, whether it's the poor person or... And so it's a debate among the left, among liberals themselves, in who is it? How are we to relate to this doctrine? And it's a successful doctrine. If you look at, I mean, all Americans seem to be worried more about the growth of Islam in Europe, but apparently there are more Muslims in Latin America than in Europe. And it's a philosophy, an ideology that's growing. You can convince people, and it's an ideology that poor people are taking on, but the people who are propagating it and who have an agenda with this are people with a lot of money, and who do benefit from the status quo. So they will tell you, whether you are liberal or conservative, stay away from Islam, stay away from the doctrine. It's something that the communists could not do, because you had, in order to discuss and criticize communism, you couldn't avoid discussing Karl Marx. Try discussing Islam and bring the Prophet Muhammad in and see what happens.
Is this working? My name is Christopher Hitchens. I work for Vanity Fair, which is a small faith-based magazine in New York City. Believes in storytelling. My question, I think, is just permissible within the brackets of your book and also your talk, because you're very interesting about what happened in Somalia and to Somalis during your time there. And we've recently seen the vanquishment of the so-called Islamic courts movement in Somalia, but by people who you describe as the most hated among Somalis, namely the Ethiopians. So I would be terribly interested to hear, and I'm sure I'm not alone, what you hear from Somali friends and what you think yourself about whether an Ethiopian intervention is too high a price to pay for saving Somalia from the Islamic courts.
And you, being a white, middle-aged male, must already know the answer.
Much of you. Though I feel rather rejuvenated when you say it. Taking the veil off can inflame men. I'm just telling you that now. Someone has to tell you.
I think you already know the answer. Look, honestly, Somalia has been a construct since 1960, when the Italians, the French, and the British left. In the case of Djibouti was a French colony, the rest was Italian and British, and they left. And they left behind what they call an interim government that lasted just a few years, about 9 years before a dictatorship had overtaken it. After this dictatorship, which started in 1969 and lasted until 1990, then anarchy came on. And the only reason that the United States is interested in what's going on in Somalia today is because it might be a threat to the interest of the United States. In Somalia, being an anarchy, a place with no government, where people of all deviant behavior can group and regroup, the United States, having had the experience with Afghanistan and the Taliban, want to prevent, and particularly the Bush administration wants to prevent that such islands of terrorism can arise. Now, there are two ways of going about it. One way is, let's ignore this place, let them sort out their business, and we'll see what they make of it. If they want to go through centuries of medieval treatment and they want to go back with the Islamic courts to the 7th century, fine. I don't really think that many Americans care beyond caring in the moral sense. Like, people would say it's terrible what's happening there, but they would never put policy and money and American lives to go out there and do it. One, and I would say in the international, in theory on international relations, one of them that is emerging, and I think what we still see as people being called the neoconservatives is, if America interferes at all, then it should not only be about the American interest. You can put a moral, a moral mortgage on things by saying, look, we are going to improve things. We are not going to leave Afghanistan without a government. We are going to put in a government there to prevent, we're going to bring in democracy, we're going to prevent Al-Qaeda-like and other terrorists from making their home. That's not what is happening in Somalia today. What is happening in Somalia today is we see people reverting back to the old theory of having a neighboring country or a force within the place, within Somalia, in trying to remove the bad guys. So America will finance them and will help them and so on, and then hopefully waiting until the problem solves itself. Now, we've seen that in many countries that hasn't worked. And I don't think it's going to work at all. And it's not about Somalis and Ethiopians hating each other. It's about Ethiopia being a dictatorship, Ethiopia being bad for its own people, and Ethiopia will maybe send the troops under pressure from the United States for now, but that is never going to be long-lasting. And the Somali, the alternative, they call themselves the secular movement who want to oust the Islamic courts, they're not dedicated to the American interest of establishing a democracy and establishing the rule of law and so on and so forth. They just want to take the money for a while, use it, and then see what happens next. This is a place where we live by the day. We don't have long future plans on building democracies and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry to disappoint all of you. The new, reverting back to the old policy of helping the bad guy to serve the interests of the United States is not going to help. It's only going to postpone a problem and make it bigger and worse.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Abdurrahim Fukara. I'm from Al Jazeera Television here in Washington. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on both the book and your personal courage. Secondly, if you'll allow me a little prologue before I ask you my question. I, much like yourself, was born in Africa. I was born in Morocco and emigrated to Europe, where I spent 14 wonderful years in the UK before I moved to the United States, where I've been here for about 7-8 years now. And despite the implications of 9/11 for both Americans and Muslims living in the United States, I think that the United States remains a great host for Muslims, many of whom, by the way, may agree with some of your criticisms of Muslim society. My question is, what are in your eyes the major defects of the West? And a second question about immigration. What do you see as the fundamental difference between Muslim immigrants from Africa integrating or trying to integrate into Europe and Christian African immigrants trying to integrate into European society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The major and most important defect I see among, if you ask me, and you're asking me to grossly generalize, let me do that because it doesn't hold on for everyone. But that is to say, the West has come to regard the values of freedom, the yardstick of human rights, as something Western. Many of them, especially in Europe, take the values and the institutions of freedom, the institutions on science, freedom, curiosity, the individual, rule of law, they've come to take that so for granted that they're either not aware of the threat against it, they're not aware of the fact that you have to be sustain it day by day, as is with all man-made things. If this building, the roof will leak and the paint will fall and you have to repaint it, you have to maintain it all the time. It seems that people have forgotten that. And perhaps part of the reason is because the generation that's now enjoying all the freedoms in the West is not the generations that built it. These are generations that inherited it. And like companies, family companies, often you'll see, for those of you who are interested in economics, the first generation and the second generation are almost always more passionate about the brand and the family company and keeping it all in the family. And then the third generation live, use, take the money, and they're either overtaken by bigger companies, swallowed up, or they go bankrupt. And I think that there is an analogy there in that the generations after the Second World War living today in Europe, United States may be different, but I'm here much too short to say anything about that, is that there are people who are so complacent. They've always been free. They just no longer know what it is, what freedom costs. That might be, I think, for me, that would be making the big mistake. And you can see it by look at the education systems in Europe. History is no longer an obligatory subject. Science is no longer an obligatory subject. School systems have become about, look at Holland, our country, where they have allowed parents to be, in the name of freedom, to build their own schools, that we now have schools founded on what the child wants. So if the child wants to play all day long, then that is an individual freedom of the child. And so it's up to the child to decide whether to do math or to play. and in our country, in Holland, in the name of freedom of education, the state pays for these schools. And I was raving against Muslim schools. And I thought about these schools and I was like, okay, in Muslim schools, at least they learn to count, It's all relative. So there's a bit of that. And then is there a difference between, for example, Christian Africans and Muslim Africans? And I want to expand on that and say, if you look at the UK, for example, is there a difference between Indians and Pakistanis? Is there a difference about Ismaili Muslims and Sunni Muslims? And what we see often, again and again, is that the tribalism, because tribalism is something which I think almost all third world populations have not really dealt with properly, is when they come in, you have the usual obstacles to integration. You want to be with your family. You want to stick with people with whom you speak the same language. There's the need to help others and so on. And that's what we see with Christian Africans. There are difficulties with integration until the second generation or the third generation, and then somehow they seem to disappear. We've seen it in Holland with the Surinamers coming from not Africa, but from the former colony of Suriname, where the first generation was extremely difficult, lots of clashes, but now in terms of education and in terms of labor on the labor market, they perform just as highly as the native populations or just as lowly. With the Muslim populations, it seems to be increasingly, it seems as if the parents were more integrated than the second generation, as if the second generation is doing better than the third generation. And again, we can't overlook this, but there is still kids who grow up in Holland or in France or in the UK, who speak the language, who understand the system, who are eloquent on it, and who say, I know what democracy is, I know what the rule of law is, but I don't want any part of it. I want to follow the Quran and the Sharia, and I'm convinced more by that. And I think that it's time that we really face up to that and understand it and tell these kids, well, the system that you long for has been tried and tested, and it's a bad one.
Just a quick follow-up on my first question. Where I was going with my first question is, what is your assessment of the contribution that the West has made to the kind of despotism that you're talking about in Muslim societies in Africa and elsewhere in the Muslim world?
The West, the British, when they came to Africa and to Muslim countries, and the French, when they came, they did a lot of horrific things, yes. They colonized, they took away resources, they enriched themselves, and so on and so forth. That's one side of the story. Another side of the story is they left, where they stayed long enough, education systems, for example, which I attended and you attended, where we learned to read and write, where we took note of the vocabulary of fighting for a better place and improvement of social lives. And I think that makes what the West has done or has not done more complex. And I'm not making an excuse for the atrocities that white people being in Africa have committed. I'm only saying let's appreciate what those white people who reacted to that have accomplished. And that the search for individual freedom and the building of institutions to ensure that those freedoms are held in place, that is something that may have been founded here, may have been established here, but that these are universal things, and that it doesn't make sense to reject them, and it also doesn't make sense to say we are going out on a journey of inventing a set of human rights that are Islamic by nature, or Chinese by nature, or Russian by nature. Unfortunately, they've been there before. There's nothing original we can find in that. What we can do is we can, perhaps like the Japanese have done, hang on to whatever it is that is important in our cultures, like the Japanese have done, but try and copy that as fast as we can and catch up. We drive in cars, we fly in airplanes, you're wearing a suit, I'm wearing in something designed by a middle-aged white man. But why do we reject the values so deeply? I mean, I want to follow the Prophet Muhammad as a moral guide, but today in the 21st century, 3/4 of what he said doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. I mean, it's taking us to a precipice. That's my message. I'm not saying that we have to make excuses for what Westerners and white people have done wrong. That's history, and it's all open. We are not open about our history.
I'm Greet de Keizer. I'm a Belgian reporter. Ayaan, do you see more extremism in Muslim societies in Europe than here in the US? And if you see that, why is that?
I live in the United States for 6 months, perhaps 3 of which I spent in Europe. So I'm not sure I can make that comparison. I know from my conversations with people from the State Department and from people from the FBI that there are so-called Al-Qaeda cells here present in certain places, and they're following them. Again, I know that I've been told that in Latin America, which is just the backyard of the United States, there are more Muslims living there, radical or not, than there are in Europe. So is the situation in Europe worse than the situation in the United States? It's difficult to say. I want to make a very careful statement. I have no data yet, nothing. It's no more than just a theory. And that is the radical Muslims that we see in Europe have a profile in which they are very young, very enthusiastic, and want to get to the utopia of the caliphate as soon as possible, preferably through terrorist attacks. The radical Muslims we see in the United States are more sophisticated, have more money, have more time, and have understood that it pays very patiently. Go to the universities, the schools, the justice system, the media, they invest a lot in it. They want to get to the caliphate as well, but by means of persuasion. And it's up to Americans to see that and to estimate it as they should. It's not, I mean, you cannot, again, like I said, it's no more than just a thought. In both Europe and the United States, and by the way, also in Islamic nations, military means and police means are not the only answer. They're just part of the answer, and they only address the most urgent questions. What we need to do is to define together what exactly is it that we are against. What is a threat to the system of liberal democracies, the open society? If we define that as terrorism or as a fringe of radical Islam, then we'll just continue to talk in circles. If we define it as this is the philosophy, the way of life, the concept or the recipe that Islam defined as submission to the will of Allah, contained in the Quran, left by the Prophet Muhammad, and now being used by the bin Ladens of this world, if we define it as such, then I think that it is not going to be, it may be less difficult than we think to convince individual Muslims that that may not be the best way to go. And that's exactly what we are not doing. We are respecting, so-called, the Muslims. We don't want to offend them, but we don't want them to become radicals. And every day, the radical Muslims monopolizing the hearts and minds of larger numbers of Muslims, because there is no competition, there is no alternative. We wake up to more and more people being convinced that that's the best way to go. Days.
My name is Andrea. I work for Senator Bond. I also graduated from American University, Cairo, and had the opportunity 5 years ago, had the opportunity to go back in August and found that a bunch of my friends who were not covered before are now covered, and that it was actually the girls that were pushing for, I would say, more Islamist way of life. And it disturbed me because their mothers, have pictures in mini skirts, and here the girls are with the gloves and the hijab and everything else. So my question to you is, looking from the outside as Americans, what can we do? I mean, I found this at the American University of Cairo, not Cairo University. What, as Americans, can we do to help facilitate some kind of dialogue that is an alternative to this Islamic movement? Because I think a lot of times we're seen as just Americans now and just outsiders. And so what we say falls on deaf ears, regardless of our argument. So is there things that you think that we can do to help aid this kind of dialogue?
Look, what the radical Muslims assume. I was 15 years old, or 16 years old, and there comes a teacher, Sister Aziza, and she assumes, she doesn't see in me a Somali, she doesn't see in me as a student, she sees in me as a potential person and all the other students to convince of her own ideas and her way of life. And so she incites in me, you should cover, you should be aware of what your body is doing to men when you walk the streets, you're sinning, and so on and so forth. Now, if you make, as an American or as a non-American, if you make the same assumption, and you think, okay, there are all these young people, and they're being convinced of this philosophy, I have a better idea, and tell them and address exactly what the radical Muslims are addressing, and that is, if we stick just to the example of the veil, tell them, you have to wear the veil because you will show your body, and if you show your body, then all these men here will go crazy and they'll go into a frenzy and you will cause chaos and so on. And you will say, that's not true. I have a better philosophy in which men can be groomed into sexual self-restraint so that you don't remain responsible for them. You don't have to lower your gaze. You don't have to stay in the house. You don't have to cover yourself. I know the Prophet said that, but he said that in the 7th century. And he said that in a context that was so different from the context that we live in now. And we have discovered now that you can groom men, you can raise them to understand their sexuality and to restrain it. Then I think you will not convince everyone, but at least you will convince those minds that are curious and that want to listen to you. And I assure you, whether it's in Egypt, Muslims in Egypt, or Muslims here, no one is going to have a conversation with you if they don't want to listen to you, if they don't want to engage with you. And the problem is, many Westerners, when talking to us Muslims, is you're so apologetic and so, oh my God, maybe I will say the wrong thing, that you just don't make a convincing case. And when I see the radical Muslim and he says, this is how you should do it, this is the best way to go about it, somehow it makes sense and it's very consistent. And that's my way of doing things, is regard us just like you would regard any other individual endowed with reason, whom you may persuade, whom you may not persuade. And if you do not persuade, we'll see that. But I think, and I really think that is that you can appeal to the reason of those 1.2 billion Muslims and convince, and most of them will be no less or no more reasonable than any other population in the world. I mean, in that time of equality, I believe, and that's my assumption. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I do now.
Abdul Shakur Aboud, Voice of America. Congratulations for the book. But the question here concerning the dialogue and helping the people. As a Muslim, because you automatically disqualify what the Prophet Muhammad is saying, 3/4 of it, how can you, coming in with that, knowing that the Muslim faith is that you're taught and you believe in that, you totally disqualify it and say it's not going to work in this century? On what basis do you think? Do you think that the Western democracy, why? Because we are driving and we are living, but he will tell you, I'm still living in poverty, I'm oppressed. what are the solutions? How can you say democracy works? Democracy is being told you're going to other places and it's not working, it's poverty. American, you'll say, okay, we have the freedom of expression, but where is the other freedom? There is a lot of poverty, there is few who are rich, you just said yourself. So how do you qualify that and say that it's not going to work? And don't you see that those who have tried it, probably they're trying under specific pressure or just because of power greed, rather than looking at it more deeply?
You say you work for the Voice of America.
What's the problem working with Voice America?
Yeah. Well, look, there are 900,000 attempts. There were 900,000 attempts in 2004 made by Muslims, people from Muslim countries, to enter Europe. Go anywhere representing the Voice of America to any Muslim country and ask the populations there, if you were to have the opportunity to take a plane, where would you like to go? I bet you half of those under 18, half of those under 25, perhaps half of those under 30 will tell you they want to come to America. There is something about open societies, whether we like it or not, that is appealing. Yes, you can be poor, but you can be poor sometimes by choice. And I would rather, by the way, be poor and free than be poor and a slave of a dictatorship or live under anarchy. The trouble with Islam is it does not offer as a recipe for society. And it's been tried in Saudi Arabia, it's been tried in Iran, it's been tried in Afghanistan, it's been tried in several other places. It does not offer. It simply does not offer the same answers to political, social, and cultural equations that liberalism as a philosophy offers and has offered. And states and societies based on liberalism are not perfect. There is poverty, there is oppression, there are so many imperfections. But if you compare it to everything that humanity has brought about since humanity was started or was founded, or depending on what you believe in the evolution or Adam and Eve and what it all brought, it's not the best. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system. And the very fact that you're standing here in the United States and that you can criticize America and Americans and that they just have a good laugh at it proves your own point. Proves my point and puts the burden of proof on you. Because I don't know where you come from, but go to any Muslim country and try that out with any Muslim. As a Muslim, if I want to criticize the moral guidance of Prophet Muhammad anywhere in an Islamic country or anywhere where Muslims are a majority, I'll be killed immediately, and so will you be. And I think for me, as long as that is the case, I find this system to be more valuable than that other system.
My name is Salama Na'mat, and I'm a journalist. I'm curious as to how do people in Somalia look at you today? Do you feel that you have set an example for Somali women, or do you have support among Somalis and other Muslim countries? You've already established some kind of recognition in the West for your work and for your dissent, if I may use that word. Do you long for some kind of recognition in your own country, in the Muslim world, that you have not yet achieved? Thank you.
There are Muslims and Somalis who have told me, individual Muslims and Somalis, who send me emails, who call me, who come to me to the streets and tell me, we are proud of what you're doing. I think in the same way as you do. And when I tell them it's not fair because it's me who's taking on all the terrible criticism and threats and so on, they say, yes, but you have protection and we don't. There are some prominent figures in Holland, in the UK, not all Somali, some of them Somali, some of them non-Somali. But if I compare them to the number of people who think that I'm selling out, that I'm betraying them, that I'm discussing, insulting the Prophet and so on, that number is far larger. That's just how things are. But I think that there's this advertisement every time whoever takes a plane, I think it's by HSBC, who say every long journey starts with one step. And I think in the case of an enlightenment to the Muslim world, we are probably in the first steps. And I'm glad to be a part of that. But the number of people who say that they appreciate what I do from the Muslim world or from the Somali world are not that many, no.
Thank you for a magnificent presentation.
Thank you.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, author of Infidel, speaking at the American Enterprise Institute, where she's a resident fellow. For more information, visit aei.org.